these are really cool, like big chunks of like existential thinking. And so let's apply some of that to the media, because you do a good job of speaking about the media. Specifically, you quote, partisan media increases polarization, not by polarizing moderates, but by increasing polarization among those already away from the political center. In short, like-minded media take people who are already somewhat extreme and make them even more extreme. And that's William Lemondusky. But the idea there is that my mom and her friends watch Fox News. And they did that because my mom was married to a Rush Limbaugh Fox News guy. And I love him. I mean, they're no longer together, which is actually better. But I don't think he's a bad person based on it. But he did change my mom's views, while they were married for 40 years. And it was one of those things where it's a partisan piece. And I think that you talk about here, you said in this chapter, access the role of partisan selective exposure and how it plays a role in our lives. Do I watch partisan news like MSNBC or Fox News rather than PBS News or NBC, CBS, and ABC News Nightly? And this was really good because we do as a group, and this is both sides of the political aisle, say that our media is so biased that it's no longer useful. And you actually help. This is the one thing you did a lot of good things with this book, but this was really clear to me, and I wanted to get your take on it, is that per a bunch of different surveys that you chronicled in your book, we aren't that polarized. If you look at NBC News and ABC News, so if you're looking at someone from the actual news channel, it's boring news. It's not, right? It's very different than MSNBC and Fox because that's opinion-based. And that's not really news, right? Those are news-related pundits and punditry and hosts, and it's more op-ed, gone viral kind of stuff. And I don't think I haven't had that discussion, to be clear, about the differences between that. You want to talk a little bit about Lester Holt versus Hannity?
Right.
There's a really big difference.
Yeah. And I think this is the part of the book I think that most people are surprised about or push back most against the research that I share in this, because it's so counter to the narrative that we generally hear. But a lot of really good research has come to the conclusion that when you look at your standard news sources, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, NBC, CBS, ABC Nightly News, PBS NewsHour, that they're not biased. They don't exhibit a consistent partisan bias. And that doesn't mean that, one source doesn't lean a little to the left or one a little to the right, or at, 1 year, a little to the left and the next year, a little to the right. But overall, looking at your mainstream media news outlets, there isn't a partisan bias. And this is, again, and there have been studies where they've done this, and I've done this in my own classes. I just take, pick whatever issue, right now it's been the debt ceiling that's been in the news. And, you can take a news article from any of those papers, the Wall Street Journal, which has a reputation of being conservative. The New York Times has a reputation of being liberal. You cut out their main section news stories on that, and you cut off New York Times, you cut off Wall Street Journal, and you give it to students, and they can't tell the difference, but which is which, because it's, for the most part, it's just sort of straight reporting, on the facts. And it's gotten a little bit more complicated since Trump, because there is a debate within the media about, because largely it was always sort of reporting he said, she said, the Democrat says this, the Republican says this. But now there's a debate about, should there be fact checking, within the main, Donald Trump said this, but it's not true. And is that injecting a bias or not? But generally speaking, at least previous to Trump, the research shows that there's not this consistent partisan bias. So that begs the question, well, why does everybody think that there is one? And part of that is because party leaders keep telling you that there is. And so if we expect that there's this bias, we'll find one. And there's good research that backs that up as well.
Yeah.
But one of the other major issues is that we mistake editorializing for, news reporting. And there's a fundamental difference between the two. Yeah. And so and it used to be easier, when we had the newspaper, and if you had a physical newspaper and the front pages that was just your straight reporting on what was happening. And then you turn to the last couple pages and it said op-ed, and it was very clearly marked and so on. But now it's harder because online it still will be labeled often, but it's a lot smaller and it's sort of all together, and you're just sort of clicking on links, and or people watch these shows at night on MSNBC or on Fox News, and it looks like they're talking about politics, they're talking about news, they're sitting behind a desk, right? They look like they're a reporter, but these people aren't journalists, they're not reporters, they're commentators, and there's a fundamental difference. And they've done studies on this as well, where Americans can't tell the difference between the two. And so if you're watching Fox News and you're a Democrat, you're going to, you're watching Hannity, you're rightly going to say like, oh, this is so biased. But then you sort of paint with this big brush that the media is biased, or, you're a Republican and I see this all the time on Twitter, where, a conservative source will sort of have, oh, look at this Washington Post article, this, typical liberal Washington Post, but they just link to an editorial. Well, right. It's an editorial written by a liberal person. It's supposed to be opinionated. That is not the Washington Post in general. And so we have to be careful about, knowing what we're reading. Are we reading opinion pieces? Are we watching opinion shows? Or are we looking more at, straightforward news reporting? And each has its place. I consume both, but it's important to know what you're dealing with. And a lot of people conflate the two, and that's where we get into problems.
That's such a good point. Have you heard of the book Bad News by Batya Ungar-Sargon?
No.
So she is the senior editor. I'm not exactly sure, but she's pretty high up at Newsweek. And this book itself is it's a pretty, I don't want to say it's a scathing indictment, but it's pretty rough on the New York Times and the Washington Post specific to that claim. And she talks specifically about things like memos that were circulated as early as 2014 that talked about the reporters having bias because they needed to serve their social graph. So if you are a reporter that, is of a very popular reporter for the Times, as an example, and let's say you're 32-year-old female and you're a Yale grad or a Columbia J School grad, and most of your audience is very liberal because they know statistically 91% of people who subscribe to the New York Times are Democrats. They know this. They also have a group called the DSG. It's the Digital Services Group inside there that tests headlines and tests content to see which resonates best with their audience. So, there's a lot of things that, contribute to this discussion about, is media so biased now that they can no longer report the news? And I have this discussion with a lot of my friends on the right. A buddy of mine, Kevin, and I'd say his last name, with that being discreet, Hicks. We get into this all the time. And we have a lot of fun together because if I post a New York Times article, say, I can't take you seriously if you quote the New York Times. I'm like, well, no, this is a reporter. This is news. This isn't the op-ed side. They do good news, and they have 200 actual articles a day coming out of the New York Times. So yeah, they're going to screw things up and they're going to have some biases here and there, but as an overall, they do pretty well. And, the Post, same thing on the news side. But I don't think anyone of reason argues that either one of those publications leans left, because they just do. But I think it's to your point, it is the line has been so muddled in between op-ed and true news reporting that the reputations of these stalwart August publishers are in jeopardy based on that. And I don't think people really understand the width and breadth of the reporting from the New York Times. It's a global organization, and it does amazing reporting. If I want to know something about China, in the Washington Post, the same thing. Josh Rogan is a guy that if I want to know what's going on with China, I read him. That's been his beat for years, and he's a fantastic reporter. And, Brett Stevens is a reporter that I really enjoy, who's a conservative for the Wall Street Journal. And those are the kind of reporters that I will go to. Robert Costa, another person that I trust almost implicitly. There's it's almost as though you have to trust reporters more so than the paper. If you can kind of build a relationship with the individual versus the institution, I think that's actually a better play most of the time when it comes to, getting to the granularity of what we're talking about. But yeah, this was a really neat piece because I think you did a great job of pushing that out. And you actually talked also, it was a study from Dave Ignacio and Mike Allen from Michigan State that conducted a meta-analysis to determine the degree to which the mainstream media actually exhibits partisan bias. And this was from 1948 to 1996, and then a follow-up study. But it proves that the Shorenstein Center on Media did the same thing. But their report, which you can comment on too, it wasn't just that it was a bias specific to an ideology, left versus right. It was what we know in the news business is that if it bleeds, it leads. So there's an issue around the polarization being part of the decision. Because if the content itself, which was in the Shorenstein Center on Media, concludes that it's the preference of a negative article for a publisher far outweighs that of a positive article. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, and this is, one of the reasons why we're so apt to see a partisan bias in the media when there isn't one is a lot of the biases within ourselves. And so if we have our biases too, of course, reporters do as well, but at least there are safeguards in place. Again, not that they're always perfect, but to try to, keep those in check. And a lot of times, with these good newspapers, this is another, activity I do with students is when I ask them to try to determine, is this a right source or a left source? Well, how do you do that? Well, you can obviously look at tone, but you can also look at, all right, who do they, how many sources do they have on the right? How many sources do they have on the left? How many lines do they give that source, right? And when you do this, I mean, a lot of times the students are amazed, like, oh, they talked to 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats. Those 3 Republicans have 15 lines total, in the story. The Democrats have 15 lines total in the story. So obviously somebody is counting that and being aware of that, right? But when you show people, and again, they've done studies like this, you have a newspaper article and they craft it so it's very, very neutral, in every imaginable way. And then you give it to Republicans and they say that it's got a pro-democratic bias. And then you give it to Democrats and they say it's got a pro-Republican bias. And they're looking at the same article, right?
Yeah.
So really, the biases within themselves, they're projecting it onto that it's what they're seeing. And this is, and this gets back to your question here. That also plays in, this idea of if it bleeds, it leads. The news does have a bias for negative information. And
it does.
So if you are, and I share some examples in the book, but if you are a Democrat and you're reading a story about how the online launch of Obamacare was a disaster, you're going to read that and you're going to see that as a partisan bias. And Democrats are going to say, they're not talking about how many lives this is going to save. They're just, talking about this failed website launch. They're going to get it fixed and it's going to be fine. Why are they always focusing on the negative? And likewise, if it's a story about a Republican's primary policy initiative and something goes awry, the press is going to report it, right? And that it was a disaster, that it was a failure. And Republicans are going to see that as a bias against their party. So if you have a bias, do this. Just a little suggestion that you can ask yourself, if the media was reporting this, right, and you see that as biased against your own party, would they have run the same story if it happened to the other party, right? And so you think about the affairs with Donald Trump. If you're a Republican, you might look at that and say, oh, this is the liberal media, right? They're focusing on Donald Trump and all these allegations of sexual misconduct and assault and all this sort of thing. But we have evidence that when Democrats do that, it gets coverage, right? Bill Clinton is a perfect example of that. It's the media didn't try to cover that up or hide it under the rug. I mean, the media is going to report that, and they did report it a lot because it's salacious. It's a scandal, right? It sells papers. And so a lot of times we see things that might be what's called the adversarial bias or the structural bias. and we interpret it as a partisan bias, when actually it's just sort of these other things that tends to sway what the media is covering.
Well, money. I think that's the big piece, right? It's for me as an, you probably don't know this about me, but I spent 20 years in the advertising business. So I worked at ad agencies and New York Times as a client, and we bought media from them. But the idea there is that we in the media business know that polarization sells.
Right.
Right. It's the idea behind it is so important, and being in the middle of anything doesn't work.
Yeah.
Right. So that's a piece too. If the story itself is going to criticize a Democrat and it's at Fox News, it's going to sell.
Right.
If you wrote a good story about a really cool bipartisan relationship, like Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, right?
Right.
That's not a story that's going to get any traction today.
Yeah.
And if your organization as a whole, which many do, it's ad revenue based. Mm-hmm. And so if you don't get a bunch of clicks or you get a lot of traffic, right, at your site, you're not getting paid. So you're not going to put a cool story together about, the beauty of Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, or, John Boehner and Obama back in the day. Or we had these relationships. They don't sell. And that's another thing that I think you did a great job of pointing out to your readers, is that, there may be some biases. And then you talk about the delineation between op-eds and news, and how it works specific to, we call it angertainment in the media business, or engagement by enragement, however you want to look at it. It's all of these things that we know are going to be powerful. Even the people that, when they talk about my show, I have friends like, Joe, you got to get it. You got to mix it up. You got to piss people off. And I'm like, it's just not my game. And the whole idea of what we're trying to do is get across complex issues to people that really want to understand it. Yeah. And if you don't hate each other in the process, you can actually learn something, right? That's kind of the idea. So
when I was shopping the book, I had a publisher tell me, he's like, I think it's a great idea. He sent some chapters and said, I really like it, but, we're going to pass because it's, like he said, if this was a book about hating the one side or the other, it'd sell a lot more. So they, and so that's why I ended up going with, an academic publisher, because it's, the popular press, they've got to sell books, and as you said, it's got to make people angry. And, that's what draws the attention. But that sort of feeds into all this, and it feeds into that false polarization that we were talking about, why Democrats and Republicans think so low of the other side, and we hate the other side, and we think that they hate us because we're so different. That's all because of what we read. And I fall sway to that, even though I know all this stuff. And when I'm scrolling through my Twitter feed or whatever, it's depressing, and it's just a lot of anger and resentment. And I constantly have to remind myself, this isn't the real world. This isn't your average typical Democrat or Republican. If you don't have friends who are the average typical Democrat or Republican, in your head, you have this vision of the most extreme. You have these caricatures of who these folks really are. And that distorts how you see them. It distorts how you feel about them. And, that's why we're so angry about stuff, and angry. We hate these other folks that we don't even really know who they are. We just have caricatures in our head of who they are, and we hate that caricature. And that's not good for a democratic society, where you're supposed to recognize the political equality of those across the aisle and work together and try to compromise and solve problems.
No, and that's sadly where we are with both sides, which is a tough thing to say. I don't like the word both sides, because it seems like there's too many false equivalencies, but in this case, it's accurate. We have the far left who believes, in some ways, that all white people are racist, right? That's about an 8% of our democratic progressives or activist class, whatever you want to call them. And then on the far right, you have people that believe what took place on January 6th was the kumbaya on the Capitol steps. And so you're not going to get those people to agree on anything. Right. And that's never really been an audience of, true news, right? Fox News is not catering to those people, and MSNBC is not catering to those people. But I think what you talk about in chapter 6 is evaluating false political information, and how key that is, because the problem that we now have specific to the macroeconomic piece or the macro piece to our politics is that we have a very small vocal minority that dictates the primary elections in both parties. And because of that, there's not a lot of conversation about things. And so you talk specifically here and you give a good example of what we can do specifically to evaluating headlines and articles, right? Which is the lateral reading, which I talked about before. It includes investigating the source and the author and the author's sources. And obviously I do this as a reporter, but it will help people even that are listening to say, if they see something from their party that seems really off base, that, maybe I should triangulate this at some level. Maybe I should look at another source. So if this was Fox, maybe I could go to The Hill, or maybe I could go to, the New Republic or National Review. I should use a better example. And so maybe they did report on this. And if that's the case, the National Review is a publication that has a little more credibility than like OAN or Newsmax or any of those things. But so is the article there? And you gave an example in November of 2022, which is really recent, where Donald Trump retweeted a racially charged graphic with the headline, U.S. Crime Statistics 2015. And the image showed that the Crime Statistics Bureau of San Francisco claimed that 16% of whites were killed by whites. 81% of whites were killed by blacks. So you're like, okay, I can say as someone who lives in San Francisco, I know there's no such thing. But what you talked about is that when asked about this quote, Trump claimed that the sources are very credible. And of course, there's no such thing as the Crime Statistics Bureau of San Francisco.
Right.
But there was, in fact, the FBI figures on that same thing, which he had to pull the numbers from because they were the mirror image of what he said, which was that 81% of whites being killed by whites and 16% of whites being killed by blacks. It was the opposite of what he said. So had we actually done our homework on that, we would say, oh, okay, well, let's look up and see if there's such a thing called Crimes Bureau of San Francisco. Right. Because once you realize that, well, that doesn't exist. Okay, so then it can't be. But then if you plug in the numbers with Google search, you could actually see, oh, well, there was a statistic based on this. It was just the opposite of what he said. And no one checked that. And I had friends sharing that. And I actually got into a debate about that specifically because I was like, there's no such thing as the Crime Statistics Bureau of San Francisco. I remember this vividly. And my buddy was like, really? And I'm like, no, I live here. So it's the first thing I looked up. I'm like, why would it be specific to a small city? Like, that was the thing for me. I was like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Right. If they left out San Francisco, I'd have been like, oh, okay, well, let me go see what that looks like. But it just didn't exist at all. And so I think that there's a really big piece to that where we as citizens can start to do things like that. And meaning that we can start to check sources. And then there's a little bit, I saw a white paper on how social media, and actually this was Jonathan Haidt, talked about things that social media companies can do as well, specific to prompts. If you're quoting this, you're retweeting this or sharing it on Facebook, they would have prompts that say, are you sure about this source?
Right. Which
was an incredible red stop sign. A lot of people, if they got just these, random prompts, they wouldn't share it. Or if they were too busy. They're like, fuck it, I'm not doing it. I'll just get it. I'm not sharing it, right? But we don't do that. Social media doesn't do that either. That's a whole different discussion we can have. But the idea of what you're talking about is to evaluate a little bit specific to authors and sources, which I think is fantastic advice. And you follow that up in chapter 7 by talking about political numbers, which I thought was another great example. You talked specifically on February 9th, 1950, Joseph McCarthy said, the State Department is thoroughly infested with communists. I have here in my hand a list of 205 that were known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party. And part of this, and why this opening was so powerful, is that when you use numbers for folks, it has a framing effect that is more credible. Correct? You want to chat a little bit about that? Because I thought that was pretty fascinating.
Yeah. I want to go back and just really quickly touch on one of the things you were talking about, false equivalency. And one of the reasons why I just focused a lot of the research that I share is just experimental research, survey research. And it shows that almost universally that Democrats and Republicans are both equally susceptible. I mean, it's unbelievable how, when you look at these studies, if 60% of Democrats do this, 60% of Republicans do that, and so on, because we're all human and we all have these same biases. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to stay clear of some of these. I obviously use a lot of contemporary examples. I'm always really careful, though, if I do an example of a Democrat than I do of a Republican, because I want both people to read these books.
You do that very well.
and I want people, to feel comfortable, reading it from both parties. That's kind of the point. But also, I hope that people realize in these studies that, we might be able to say on this particular issue at this particular moment in history, this party's worse than that party or whatever. But when you just strip away that stuff and you put people in an experimental setting and you're sort of, giving them these things to look at, different studies or whatever, both succumb to these biases, and equally so. And that's been pretty consistent. Then in terms of, political numbers and the power of numbers, that it really has a unique effect and can distort what we think is accurate and what we think is true, because the numbers just seem to be so objective, right? And but of course, and like you were saying with the Trump tweet, you see these figures and we just sort of assume that they're true.
Yeah. But
they need not be. They could be completely distorted, or they could be misinterpreted or spun in a particular way. And one of the studies that I share, which is one of the more better known studies that I share in the book, the Dan Kahan study, and maybe some of your viewers have seen it. It's this, I won't get into the details because it's a pretty complex research design, but they show people this like skin rash. People have a skin rash and they put this cream on. Does the cream help you get better or not? And they show this, and it's a pretty complicated, semi-complicated math thing where it's these numbers in a table and you actually have to calculate a ratio. But a lot of people don't do that. But they found that people who are pretty good at math actually realized that they had to do that until it became about politics. And then they did it with gun control. And all of a sudden, then the people, the sorts of people who could figure this problem out when it was just a skin rash and skin cream, they couldn't do that. Like, they were driven by their partisanship and ideology. And so if the data said that gun control reduces violence, then Democrats sort of like jumped on that and they were able to do that, but Republicans would misinterpret it. And vice versa. If it showed, that gun control was actually, it would result in more violent crime, then it was the opposite. And it just shows that even when it comes to numbers, that our party does a lot of our thinking and it distorts how we interpret that information. It's almost as though even for people who are good working with numbers, if it's politicized, it's almost as if that ability goes away. And it seems to be, the research isn't definitive on this, but it seems to be that it's what you were talking about, the elephant in the rider, right? When we see numbers that support our point of view, that seem to support our point of view, the elephant kind of takes over and we don't think about it. But if we come upon numbers that seem to support the other party, then the rider almost takes over, right? It's like, wait a second, that can't possibly be right. And then we look into it, and those are the folks, who sort of dug into it and they're like, oh yeah, no, that's not right. But we only do that. We're hypercritical and we think critically when the information goes against our party. We don't do that when the information is sort of aligned with what we already think. And that's the real problem. It's not that, and you sort of referenced this earlier, it's not that we can't think critically or we don't know how to think critically. We just do so selectively. We do know how to think critically, but we only do so when information challenges our point of view. And then we know how to challenge that study or challenge that survey, but we don't do, which is all very good, which we should do, but we tend not to do that. So when it's our side, so you were referencing that Trump tweet, when Democrats saw that, they'd be like, this can't possibly be true, right? And then what do? You look at the source, or you dig into it a little bit. Whereas a Republican would be like, yeah, of course that's true. But if it was reverse, you would have had then the Republicans thinking critically and Democrats sort of just accepting it. And so that's what we have to really work on, is thinking critically when it's our own side.
And you talked about curiosity too, which I thought was a great word, because that's one thing I've been not accused of, but told, like, Joey, you're so curious. Like I genuinely have.
That's a bad thing.
Well, they meant it as a compliment, because it was as if I'm looking at a story, I'm trying to be objective. I mean, that's the goal of what we're doing at True 30. Is like we screw up too. We have our own biases, but it's wherever the evidence leads us is what we want to report on. And that's kind of where this really came into play with me with your book, because polls, as an example, have been a very, very powerful tool for any political wonk. Here's what the poll said. Here's where we're going. And they've changed over the years. And, polls are kind of like market research and advertising. Our running joke is that we use market research and advertising like a drunk uses a lamppost, more for support than illumination, right? Because you can make numbers do anything you want.
Right.
A regression analysis, you're like, well, if you're working with a big brand and you say, these people bought this, because we launch a campaign, we want the campaign to be successful. Mm-hmm. So you look at the campaign and then you start to look at the numbers and you're like, oh man, our traffic sucked. but then you could look and say, well, on Tuesday at 3:00, it was awesome, right? So you could share it with a client. You're like, well, the metrics are off the charts. And they're like, when? Well, day part of 2 to 4 on a Tuesday, we hit our metrics, and they're like, hey, Wade, good job. And you're like, thanks. Everyone's happy, but it's all bullshit. So it was one of those things where polls, I think, and you talk about this, and I want you to follow up too, is that you ask, when you're looking at polls, ask these questions. Are the polls samples representative? That's a great question. Are the polls questions biased? And have the polls results been inappropriately aggregated? You want to talk specifically to those 3 points, because that's a really powerful for our listeners to understand what they need to, should look into with polls.
Sure. So is the sample representative? So with any public opinion poll, if it's a good one, they will randomly select a sample of people. And this is, this is where a lot of people incorrectly think that you can't trust polls, because they see, we've got, 320 million Americans or whatever, and they're going to poll 1,500 of them. And so, and again, this intuitively, that doesn't seem right. How can you just ask 1,500 people and they're going to represent what 320 million think? Well, yes, it works. Because as long as it's random, for the most part, it will work. But representative sample just means if, 15% of your population is Black, 15% of your sample should be Black. If 50% are men, 50% of your sample should be men, 50% are women, then 50% of your sample should be women, 50% are Republican, 50% are Democrat, then that should be reflected in your sample. And they're not going to be perfect, because that's why we have a margin of error. And so I talk in there about, how to apply the margin of error. But the basic idea is that random sample, everybody in the country has an equal chance of being chosen. And if you have that, chances are the results of your poll are going to be very good. And that's very different from the kind of things that you see online where you choose to take a poll, right? That's self-selection. And that is not a random sample. And so a lot of times, and I share the example of President Trump was using these, like retweeting these polls out after debates with Clinton and so on, where he was saying, oh, look, I have 80% said I won. But these were not random samples. They were just, people going to a particular website and then they could take this poll. That's not representative. And so that's the first thing that you have to look at. And you can read that in the fine print, usually under any poll worth its salt. It will say the results of this poll are based on a random sample of this many people on such and such a date. So it's really easy to fact check that. The other stuff's a little bit more difficult, but it has become much easier in the internet age. So another thing that you should really look at is the way that a question is worded, because the way that you word a question can drastically alter the answer that you will get. And it is easier now to do this. So oftentimes if you come upon a poll online, they'll have a link that you can go in, and it will take you to the original poll. And now that might be 30 or 40 pages, but don't get overwhelmed with that. You can sort of scroll through it, and then they'll have the actual questions, and you can read the questions, and then you can just ask yourself, are these questions biased in any way? And the good polling firms, again, who are worth their salt, they work really hard. They pilot this stuff to try to craft the kinds of questions that aren't biased. But again, no one's perfect. But if you ask somebody, do you think, say on the abortion issue, do you think the government should be dictating what women can do with their bodies? That's going to give you a very different, answer than do you think women should have the right to terminate a pregnancy or something like that, right? Yep. And so you do have to sort of look at how they ask the question. And then the amalgamation part, this also gets to digging into and looking at those questions, because a lot of times when it's not so much the polling, but the way that the poll is reported, you might have, and I provide again a couple of examples in the book, but you might have people reporting a poll, like let's say that 33% of the public thinks we should always, you should be able to have an abortion whenever you want, and 33% of the public thinks you should never be allowed to have an abortion, and then the other 33% of the public thinks sometimes. Maybe health of the mother, abortion, rape, rape, incest, those sorts of things.
Yeah.
Well, you could have a group, right? Say it's a pro-life group, come along and say 66% of the American public opposes abortion. Now, that's not a false statement per se, but it's a very misleading one, because 33% of that 66%, yes, they're opposed to abortion in some circumstances, like maybe really, really late in a pregnancy, but they're also in favor of it during certain time periods. And you could have a pro-choice group do the same thing. 66% of the American public support abortion. Well, yes, sometimes, right? And so you wouldn't be able to determine that unless you actually went into the poll and found out what the actual results are, and to see if anyone sort of combined multiple categories to make it appear as if there was a majority opinion when there wasn't. And so it's not hard to do, and it's kind of fun, to do that sort of thing and dig into it when you discover things and uncover that sort of thing. But it's important that we do that, because I think a lot of times we just come upon the polls that we see and we either dismiss them when we shouldn't, or we accept them when we shouldn't. It's a lot more complicated.
It really is. It goes back to the old Stephen Wright joke. It's that 87% of statistics are made up.
Right.
Yeah. I always love that. So specifically, I also like this example because, again, from my background in media, I understand how important the questions are. And you gave a great example of, and this is Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, which is a fantastic book for anybody. I've mentioned it numerous times during my podcast, but it was an experiment with several Harvard Medical School physicians, and they were given information on lung cancer surgery, and they asked whether they would recommend the procedure to their patients. The framing, of course, was very important, but here's the catch. Some of the doctors were told that 90% of their patients who'd had the surgery survived, while the others were informed that the procedure had a mortality rate of 10%. Note that the two descriptors here are logically equivalent. Nevertheless, 84% of physicians in the survival group recommended the surgery, while only 50% recommended from the mortality group. And that's a perfect example of framing, because polls do that often. Mm-hmm. And to your point, if you look at, when I look at polls, it's the first thing I look at is the source. Was it self-selected? Was it random sampling? All of these pieces. And you can pull apart a lot of that data. Mm-hmm. And I actually got into it with an LGBTQ friend and group that I debate with, specific to a lot of the research they continue to pull, because it's not random. It's very self-selected, and there's no real citations in the research backing that. And so again, I was accused of being, anti-trans, and I was like, no, I'm not saying that. I'm with you. I'm just saying this sample doesn't work for the following reasons, right? It's not random. It hasn't been And if you look at the questions, much to your point, however you craft a question can dictate how the respondent answers the question.
Right.
And so these are great pieces of advice for our listeners. And then you also have evaluating political arguments. And I love this quote too, is he is that will not reason is a bigot. He that cannot reason is a fool, and he that dares not reason is a slave. That's really key because, I mean, we all, I think, become slaves to our own ideology at some point, depending on what we don't want to reason or we don't want to debate or we don't want to do our homework. Do you want to talk specifically about how this, the evaluating political arguments is a big part of what's going on here with our tribalism?
Yeah, so I share a great study by Druckmann at the beginning of the chapter, and what they did was there's so many wonderful research designs that I lay out, but this one's a great one. They had a couple different issues. I think it was like DACA and then offshore drilling.
Yep.
And they had a bad argument in favor and a good argument in favor for both issues. And they had a bad argument against and a good argument against. And when they didn't have any party cue, they gave like a control group these arguments, and universally people said, this is a good argument in favor of drilling. This is not a strong argument. This is a really good argument against drilling. This is not a strong argument against drilling, and so on. But then they gave another group the party cue. And what they found, while Democrats and Republicans, when there was no party cue telling you this party stands for this or this party stands for that, universally, Democrats and Republicans were able to identify good arguments as good arguments and bad arguments as bad arguments. But now when they gave you a party cue, even when they, let's say they took the weak argument, right? And they said, the Democratic Party is against offshore drilling. And here's the reason why. And it was the weak argument. And they said the Republicans are for it, and they gave you the strong argument, right? What they found was Democrats were more likely now to all of a sudden identify the weak argument as the best argument, right? And the same happened for Republicans. It was vice versa. And so what that tells us is that even when we're confronted with political arguments, the political tribalism kicks in. Even if the other side has the better argument, we will not acknowledge that. We will say that our side has the better argument. And that's just, and again, when you don't have those partisan cues there, people are, again, willing and able to think critically and identify good arguments and bad arguments. But once we inject party into it, it's like we lose that ability, because now it's not about, who has the best argument. It's about, well, this is my side, this is my tribe. And so I'm going to say that this is the best argument. And so what I do is I try to walk through, okay, well, when we do confront arguments, how are you supposed to go about evaluating these? Mm-hmm. And I talk about how you can map out arguments and identifying premises and conclusions, and then looking into, okay, what evidence is there to support these conclusions? I mean, there's a lot to evaluating an argument, looking at logical fallacies and so on. But the general tenor of the chapter, like the general tenor of the book, is that we can evaluate arguments pretty well, unless party is injected into it, and we can evaluate an argument made by the other party, and we can do so very well, but we don't do that when it comes to arguments of our own party. We just sort of accept them.
No, it's a great point. And I think you did a great job at the offshore drilling, because you actually talked specifically where the questions are, we should not drill for more oil and gas off the Atlantic coast. Offshore drilling is dangerous for workers in marine life. This argument is supported by two independent premises. So then the question is, are those premises correct? And
right.
Do they point to the actual logical conclusion? And I think that if we can break those things down, is definitely helpful in our political discourse. But I think something that we can end with, which we're way over, I'm sorry if you have to go.
It's
okay.
It's
cool.
Great.
Is that the last chapter was an election fraud. And I think that I want to kind of premise this, because again, and I probably could have done a better job of this. I've shared a couple different quotes from Donald Trump, maybe out of my own animus, but you did a fantastic job of making one comparison from a Democrat to a Republican, Harry Reid being one who made the same issues around, making a false statement. But the idea here is that election fraud is not new.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that most people don't get that. And this was you did a good job here of citing a 2012 Fairleigh Dickinson survey found that 37% of Dems believe that the Republicans committed voter fraud to win the presidential election of 2004. And 36% of Republicans believe the Dems did the same in the White House in 2012. In 2016 alone, election litigation was up 23% compared to the 2012 survey, which is not surprising considering Mr. Trump was claiming that the election was rigged before it even began.
Mm-hmm.
What is it that we can do? Well, here's another piece that I thought was telling. 2016 NBC, again, news, 72% of GOP voters believe that Obama was born outside the United States. Right. So he was never eligible to be a president in the first place. What is it that we can do? Because this is not going away anytime soon. 2024 is coming up fast. We are going to be hearing about it. We saw it in 2020. I think some of the litigation in Arizona just finished with Carrie Lake claiming that her election was rigged. This is a big thing now. On almost every election, specifically with Donald Trump, he will claim, my guess is, if past his prelude, that if he loses in 2024, should he make the primary and get in the general and does lose, I think he will claim the same. Mm-hmm. What is it that we can do as a culture to deal with this election fraud problem? Because it's a big one. Maybe one of the biggest.
Yeah, I think, that's a really good question. And it's a really tough question. We have to, as a country, as individual citizens, I just think we have to do our best to become less tribal. And because elections have always and will always be contentious. Mm-hmm. By their very nature, they're important. They're going to be emotional, but we as citizens and as political parties and our political leaders, and I think they're the ones that really have dropped the ball on this, but they're sort of catering, to the public on some of these issues. But we just need to, I think it's fine if there is evidence of fraud or something like that, that obviously that needs to be investigated. But we have to have some more trust in our institutions and in our fellow citizens. And, we were fortunate in 2020 where there were a lot of Republicans who stood up and, said, no, we looked into this and there's nothing there. It was free and fair. And, without that, I think it would have been a lot worse, because then it would have even been more tribal. At least you had some members from the Republican Party disagreeing, with Donald Trump. And I think that ultimately is what it got pretty bad, but it didn't make things worse. And it's what I write about in that last chapter. And I won't get into all the details, but I go way back to Greek tragedy, in the trilogy, the Oresteia trilogy written by Aeschylus. And it's just a wonderful story, and holy cow, is it relevant to what we're experiencing at this time? And again, I won't get into all the details. If you're interested in, I'd encourage people to read it, but there is a trial held. And before the trial is held, Athena, the goddess of wisdom, asks both sides in the trial that she explains the process. This is what's going to happen. And will you abide by the decision? And before the decision is made, both sides say, yes, that sounds very fair. And I agree to abide by the decision. And then, of course, when the decision is made and one side wins and the other side loses, the side that loses is outraged. And they say, this wasn't fair, we were cheated, and so on. And Athena comes in and she makes 2 points that I think are really important. One, to the losing side, she says, look, you have to accept this. This was a fair process. The rules of this process were laid out beforehand. you knew the rules and you didn't have any problem with it beforehand. Just because you lost, you can't take your ball and go home, right? I mean, you lost, and in democratic societies, people lose, and that's a fundamental thing that makes democracies work. And I don't think people in this country have appreciated this until as of late.
Right.
But that the losing side accepts the result. And when you don't have that, you don't have democracy, because if the losing side doesn't accept, the result, and then you have something like January 6th happen where people try to take power by force or try to stop, the election from becoming official or whatever, that's not democracy anymore. And then you don't have a peaceful transfer of power. You have one side that doesn't have power try to take it by force. And that's the ball game. And so you need the losing side to accept the loss. But the other important part, I think, that we don't think about enough, and this is also what Athena says, is she tells the losing side that they will be respected and they will be appreciated, and that they will have an important voice in Athenian society going forward. And that's what I call the magnanimity of the victors, is that, when our side wins an election, we can't gloat about it. We can be happy and we can be thrilled and excited, and we should be. But we also have to realize that half of the country is crestfallen. I mean, we all know what it's like to have our side lose an election and how that hurts and how there's fear there. But if we have another side that comes out and reaches across the aisle and, as we've had presidents throughout the past say that I am the president of all the American people, not Democrats or Republicans or whatever, that we're going to look out for the best interest of the American people. And you bring them into a coalition of governing, you compromise. But we're sort of losing that now, where we think that if we win the election, our side could just do whatever it wants. And now we have presidents all the time talking about mandates. I have a mandate with, you won 50% of the vote or 51% of the vote. Is that really a mandate? And so you need both of that, and they both feed off each other. If we want the losing side to accept the outcome of an election, we have to make them feel comfortable that they're going to be a part of that government going forward. And we're going to work with them, and we're going to compromise, and we're not always going to agree, but that's democracy. And if we don't want that, we don't want that. If you want your side to win 100% of everything and you see the other side as evil and they need to be destroyed, then we're not going to have a democracy. And we need to acknowledge the other side's political equality, even if we think that what they believe in and what they're working towards is injustice. We have to allow them to vote, and we have to allow them to advocate for that, even though we think it's immoral, that we think it's wrong. We have to try to convince them that they're wrong. This is what a democratic society is, and it's not pretty, and it can be messy, and it can be ugly, and progress can be slow. But at the end of the day, the alternative is taking power by force. And if you take power by force, then they're just going to try to take it by force as well. And before you know it, you're not living in a democratic society. And so we need to learn how to lose graciously in this country, but we also need to learn how to win graciously in this country. I'm sure you might experience it. One of the things that, no one ever used to keep their political signs up or the political flags, Trump flags and stuff, like when the election's over, And it wasn't like that when I was growing up, but now it's this sort of perpetual campaign. And so elections can be contentious, but it used to sort of happen for a couple months and then it went away. But now it's sort of just constant. And I think it's social media and cable news, but it's always sort of, we're poking each other in the eye. And that needs to change if we want to try to, again, reduce the temperature a little bit.
No, I appreciated that, how you closed out the book with that Greek tale, because it was very well written and I really enjoyed reading that. And I think that, you also referenced John F. Kennedy not trying to humiliate the former Soviet Union after the Cuban Missile Crisis,
right,
which I thought was really neat. And then what really harkened back immediately for me was George W. Bush and how his gracious defeat and how he wrote a wonderful letter and how he embraced Michelle Obama. I mean, their relationship publicly, I think, was so helpful to the cause, right? There was obviously a division between this, but W is someone who I very vocal during his administration. I thought made a lot of mistakes, and I didn't think he was, equipped for the job. I never thought he was a bad person. That was the difference. And to this day, I actually think he's a mensch in many ways, and obviously he made some mistakes, but he's not someone, and he is someone I'd like to have a beer with. That's people talk about that all the time. I would love to sit down and have a beer with W. I think he's a riot. He's funny. He seems self-deprecating and kind and a good dad and a good husband. All that. I don't have any issues with that. And I think that those are reminders that kind of play into it. I also want to mention that, and maybe the reason I mentioned Donald Trump so much is that I think he is such a curveball for this, in the sense that if Mitt Romney was president right now,
right,
if Mitt Romney won instead of Donald Trump and he was our president, there wouldn't be the same division we have today in our culture. I'm convinced, in the sense that he too is a good man, and he too is a good husband and leader, and good religious man, and all of these things that I just can't find anything wrong with him as a human being. Right. But when you see someone as flawed as Mr. Trump, that just continues to double down on his vitriol and his nonsense, I think that's the hard part for us right now. And for you, I am of that, where I have to make sure I don't gloat, when something bad happens to Mr. Trump, because it doesn't reflect well on me, doesn't reflect well on my organization at True 30. It's the goal of not trying to be a partisan reporter. But I really appreciated everything you did in your book. Obviously, it was yeoman's effort on the research front. The citations were amazing. You did a really good job. Your acknowledgments, you thanked numerous people for their role in helping you put this wonderful book together. But I just want to say thank you, number one, for reaching out. This was a fantastic conversation. This was a book that taught me a lot, and I read 2 to 3 books a week on politics. So I just want to say, this was cool. Much like I mentioned to Hiram Lewis, his book was framed in such a way and dealt with information that was so important. And I think the same thing stands true here. It gets a wonky a bit, which is fine. And I think my audience will like it for that reason, because a lot of the audience that I do have is genuinely interested in understanding things as opposed to fighting. So thank you again for your time, Tim. It was great to have you on the show.
Well, thank you, Joy. Thanks for the opportunity. And it was wonderful to talk to you, and thanks for the support, and thanks for all you do.
Thank you. Cheers.